On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He didn't realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be with you this afternoon and to be able to share God's word with you. And good afternoon to everyone online as well. Wonderful to be here. St Clements is Helen's and my home church. And so this is just a great privilege to be here. And I want to thank you for your prayers and support of us. We love this community and love the way you support our ministry around the diocese. Please continue to pray for the Diocese of Tasmania, across the different islands that make up this state and the diocese. There's wonderful things going on. I think at the moment there's about 9 different churches who are in a program called Multiply Tas, where we're trying to plant new congregations and churches around the state of Tasmania. Some in the northwest, some here in Hobart, and it's a really wonderful thing. But as you'd imagine, we're meeting a lot of spiritual opposition. And I think there's not a single one that isn't facing significant hurdles. And the only way we're going to get through that is by coming to the Lord in prayer and asking for him to break the new ground and lead us through to the new things that he wants us to do. So please pray for that. We also, I'd love your prayers for next week, for Saturday morning, the ordination at St David's Cathedral. 10 people, some women, some men, being ordained, 3 new deacons in the church, and 7 people ordained priests. Please pray for them. I'm going away with them for a few days from Wednesday for a retreat as we prepare for the ordination. And of course, our own Nick Overton is going to be ordained next Saturday morning, and I'd love to see lots of you there as we support and pray for Nick as he takes this next step in his ministry. Well, this afternoon we're going to have the opportunity of thinking about this wonderful story from John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana in Galilee. But I thought we should start with a little Johnny Cash.
He turned the water into wine. He turned the water into wine. In the little Cana town, the word went all around that he...
Oh, can we have a bit more?
He turned the water into wine. He turned the water into wine. In the little Cana town, the word went all around that he turned the water into wine. Well, he walked upon the Sea of Galilee. He walked upon the Sea of Galilee. Shouted far and wide, he calmed the raging tide and walked upon the Sea of Galilee. He turned the water into wine, didn't my Lord now? He turned the water into wine in the little Cana.
Well, I've been listening, that's the third time I've listened to that today. It's like an earworm. It's going over and over in my head. And somebody told me that I needed to explain this for younger people here, who Johnny Cash is. Johnny Cash was an American country and blues singer who was a singing legend from the 50s, the 1950s up to the early 2000s. And he is one of the best-selling music artists of all time. So over 90 million albums sold. And there in that clip, he was singing at the San Quentin State Prison. One of the things he used to do was do free concerts in prisons and sing his songs. And at the San Quentin prison in 1969, he explained how he came to write that little song about our passage of scripture tonight. Johnny Cash was a devout Christian, and he and his wife were travelling through Israel on a tour, and they were on their way from Nazareth to Tiberias, which is on the Sea of Galilee, and they came to the town of Cana in Galilee. And these are his own words. He said, "We went into the little town of Cana, just over the hills from Nazareth, and there's a church that sits over the cistern where the water came from that Christ turned to wine, where the first miracle was performed. We went into the church, we saw the cisterns, and you could hear the sound of the water there, hear the echo. I was so impressed when I came out of the church. If I've ever had an inspiration, I had one then. From seeing what I had just seen and heard, I said under my breath, 'He turned the water into wine.'" On the way to Tiberias, in the car, in the next few minutes, I wrote this song. It's great, isn't it? Johnny Cash was struck by the reality, the truth of the story that we've heard from John 2 tonight. The tinkling of the water in the cistern, a big cavern under the ground, brought a whole thing to life for him. There was an eyewitness quality about the story. And when you think about it, it's a slightly odd story, especially to begin a series of signs about Jesus' true identity. It's mundane. It's ordinary. It's commonplace. There's no miraculous healing here. There's no raising from the dead. There's no feeding of 5,000 strangers on a hillside. There's no calming of a raging storm. In fact, it's a private miracle. The only people who really knew about it at first were the groom and the master of the head waiter. It was Jesus fixing a catering problem, stepping in to save a couple of young people from embarrassment of not having enough plonk at their wedding. But the domestic nature of this story makes it all the more believable. And Johnny Cash, hearing the tinkling of the water, is struck by the beauty and truth of this little narrative. So I want us to just think about this story again tonight. There was a wedding in the little town of Cana in Galilee. Now, in the ancient world, a wedding was a big deal. The whole town came out, and it was the biggest life event that anyone would have in their life. And the bride and groom were like king and queen for the week. The wedding went on for days, and they got paraded around the town, and people came out to praise them, and there was all this wonderful stuff going on, and there was lots of food and lots of drink. And we're told that Jesus' mother, Mary, along with Jesus and some of the disciples, were guests at the wedding. But very soon we learn of the catering disaster. They haven't ordered enough wine, and they've run out. This was a big deal. Wine was integral to the celebrations, and to run out was an embarrassing thing. And Jesus' mother sidles up to him and says, "They've run out of wine." Now, we're not sure why she told him. Luke tells us that Mary had been treasuring up in her heart the things that she'd heard about this baby that she'd born. She knew about his miraculous birth, obviously, and maybe she thought that he could do something about it. He's now 30 years old. Is he going to get on and do something? But Jesus' response to her is pretty blunt, isn't it? He says, "Woman, why do you involve me?" Some of the commentators try to soften this. They say Jesus only has his mother twice in John's Gospel, here and at the cross, and on both occasions he addresses her as woman. This was not a rude way to speak to your mother in the ancient world. It was a respectful thing to do. But the rest of it's pretty blunt, isn't it? What's this got to do with me? Why do you involve me? And I think he's wanting to say he's not taking directions from her. He's a free agent. But like all good mothers, she ignores his little outburst and turns to the waiters and says, "Do whatever he tells you." The text doesn't recall if there was any eye rolling on Jesus' part at his mother's interference. 6 stone water jars were nearby. We're told that each held 20 to 30 gallons. That's 75 to 110 litres. And if you're trying to work out how much water that is, if you live in Kingborough, we have 3 sizes of wheelie bins. The little ones are 80 litres. The middle-sized ones are 120 litres, and the big ones are 240 litres. We're talking about the middle-sized ones. And there's 6 of them. That's a lot of water. And Jesus tells the servants to fill them up, and they filled them to the brim. I like to think by drawing water up from the cistern that Johnny Cash looked into in the 1960s. That's probably fantasy. Then he tells them to take some of the water from the jar and to present it to the master of the banquet. Now, this guy, he's in charge of catering. He's got the RSA, the Responsible Service of Alcohol certificate. He knows the right things to do in this particular situation. He doesn't know what's happened. He doesn't know where this has come from. But something's happened. Either in the jar or in the jug on the way across the floor to him, because it's not water he's drinking, but wine. And not any wine. This is the Grange. This is the best wine. This is the good stuff. And he calls the bridegroom aside and he says, most people serve the good stuff first and wait for people's palates to get dull, and then they serve the Chateau de cardboard. But you've kept the best wine till now. That's the story. I don't know about you, but I'm left with a whole lot of questions at the end of that story. I want to know what the groom said. I want to know what the guests do then. I want to know whether everybody found out where the wine came from. I want to know whether Jesus got a whole lot more invitations to different parties that were going on around Galilee because he was so good at this stuff. And what about Mary? I've got a little picture of her in my mind sitting in the corner with a little Mona Lisa smile going, "That's my boy." But why are we told this story anyway? What can it possibly mean for us? Is this a story about catering advice? Do you now think when you invite someone over to dinner, 2 bottles of wine, which one should I open first? I often think that. What should I give them? Or is it so we can preach that Jesus was not a killjoy and appeal to our Aussie friends and say Jesus was into parties, you should come to church? Well, fortunately, John tells us. In the final verse, he tells us that this was the first of 7 signs in this Gospel of John that revealed Jesus' glory. This sign goes along with the likes of healing of the lame man, feeding of the multitude, the raising of Lazarus. Now, this is not just a catering tip, but it's a sign. It points beyond itself to the true identity of Jesus. But for us to understand this sign, I think we need to look at some clues. And I want to take you back through the story and see if there are some clues in the story that might help us work out what this is pointing to. So let's have a look at the clues. The first clue is about shame. What we don't get immediately is the depth of the situation that this story describes. Middle Eastern culture was very big on hospitality, especially in the first century. People welcomed each other into their homes and shared food and wine with each other. They were generous in their provision, and to run out of food and wine was not just inconvenient, it was that. The 9/11 bottle shop wasn't next door to fix the problem, but it was rude. It was very rude to run out of food. It undermined a basic commitment that people had to each other, especially at a celebration like a wedding. But more than that, Middle Eastern culture is an honour-shame culture. That is the primary cultural lens that you look through about the way you go about your life in the Middle East is a duty to preserve your honour and the honour of your guests, and to avoid shame at all cost. The shame of running out of food and wine would be crushing. People would be talking about you in the streets. It would be as much as if you were guilty of a crime. You see, our worldview is not honour shame. Our worldview is, until fairly recently, has been guilt and innocence. That's how Westerners view the world. You're either guilty or you're innocent. One Bible scholar I read equated this honour-shame culture with the guilt-innocence and told you that in the first century, a guest could sue the host for damages if you ran out of wine. That sent a chill down Pete and Tash Biss's spine about the wedding yesterday. Jesus stepping in with this miracle is him addressing the shame of this young couple. He knows the depth of this problem, and he meets it. Without this, the couple would hang their heads. They would never be able to show their faces in town again. And Jesus saves them from this. And this story is at least this. But I think it's more, and our second clue is going to take us there. The second clue are the words, my hour. Now, I'm not sure if you got this when you heard the reading tonight, but there's a bit of a non sequitur, a logical jump in the exchange between Jesus and his mother in the first part of the story. In reply to her announcement that they've run out of wine, Jesus dismisses her with that blunt statement, "What have you got to do with me?" And then he says, "My hour has not yet come." What's he speaking about? Well, when you read through John's Gospel, these words, my hour or Jesus' hour, are referred to several times in chapter 7 and 8 and twice in chapter 12. And each time John says, Jesus' hour, his hour had not yet come. And it's only when you get to chapter 13 and then again in chapter 17 that we discover that the hour is the hour of Jesus' death. When he refers to his hour, he's talking about his death. So here's the non sequitur. Get this. Jesus is at a wedding in Cana, and his mother comes and says, they've run out of wine. And Jesus says, woman, why do you bother me? I'm not ready to die yet. Does that strike you as odd? They've run out of wine, and Jesus says, I'm not ready to die yet. What on earth has death got to do with it? Well, one of the things we find out about Jesus is that he's often thinking about his death. He'd come to die. That was his mission, to die for the sins of the world. And it's spattered all the way through the Gospels. Little references to his death. A couple of times he comes outright to his disciples and he says, I'm going to die. I'm going to die, and 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead. I'm going to die and rise. And every time the disciples go, oh, no, we don't want to know about that. And they sweep it under the carpet. Jesus' death has something to do with this. Jesus' death has something to do with the jars and the water and the wine and the wedding. So our next clue is the water jars. 6 stone water jars. These weren't any jars. They weren't wine jars. They weren't drinking water jars. They weren't wheelie bins. They were jars for the Jewish rites of purification. You see, all good Jews knew from the Old Testament that God was holy, that God was other, that God was perfect, and that if you wanted to relate to God, you needed to somehow deal with your sin so that you could get close to him and close to his holiness. And the way you had to do that was purify yourself. And you mostly did that by offering sacrifices in the temple, an animal whose throat was cut and blood was shed, so that you could purify yourself. But day to day, people used to purify themselves by washing their hands. You'd wash your hands with purified water before you came to worship. You'd wash your hands before you came to the wedding. You'd wash your hands before you ate a meal, not for the transfer of disease, but to keep you holy, so that you are purified coming into the presence of God. And at this wedding, there were 6 stone water jars for the purification of the Jews at this wedding. They're the jars that Jesus used. But what about wine? This is the next clue. Why did he turn water into wine? Well, wine in the Bible is a symbol of God's blessing. You had wine to know that God loved you. There's a wonderful passage. It's in Isaiah 25. Have a look at it a little later. And it looks forward to the day of God's salvation. Isaiah is looking forward. He doesn't really know about Jesus coming, but he's looking forward to the promise of what God would do. And he has this wonderful word picture about salvation. And in chapter 25, Isaiah 25, verse 6, it says this: on this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? Beautiful picture of the day of salvation. These words speak of the day when God will restore us to himself. And on that day, it will be a day of feasting. The best Wagyu beef, the finest French cheeses, the Grange will be out on the table for us to drink. The finest of wines, the best wines. Nothing will be too lavish for God. It's a beautiful picture. And in this moment, in the wedding at Cana of Galilee, this little tin pot town, Jesus is giving a foretaste of that day. His hour, his death will purify us better than any stone water jar and will usher in the day of salvation when the banquet will happen. And did you notice this from Isaiah 25, verse 8? That will be the day when the sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and he will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. He will remove their shame, their even deeper shame and disgrace than running out of wine at the wedding. Now, of course, all of this takes place in the context of a wedding. And this is our next clue, the context of marriage. See, there's this image that runs through the Gospels of Jesus as the bridegroom. You see it in the other Gospels, don't you? Remember that little incident where people come up and ask Jesus about fasting? Why don't you fast? And he says, you don't fast when the bridegroom is with you? We don't need to go into what that means, but he is clearly referring to himself as the bridegroom. And that idea reaches its crescendo in the second last chapter of the Bible, in the book of Revelation that the Apostle John wrote, when he had a vision of the New Jerusalem, of the people of God, and he had this vision. He saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband, the bridegroom. And you read on in the next few verses and realize the bridegroom is Jesus and the city is the people of God. And just perhaps at that wedding in Cana, Jesus was thinking of that day when he would be the bridegroom of his bride, the church, the people of God. That he would have such an intimate relationship with them on that day. The union of Christ and his church, to which every marriage points, when he did this miracle. Perhaps he was thinking about that. The Book of Common Prayer was the prayer book of the Anglican Church for 300 years in this country, or not 300 years in this country, for 300 years and in this country until 1978. And the beginning of the wedding service, the marriage service, and if just scanning the room, maybe there's one or two people who were married before 1978 here in an Anglican church, you would have had these words at your wedding. This is how it starts. Dearly beloved, we've come together in the presence of God to witness and bless the joining together of this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The bond and covenant of marriage was established by God in creation. Here it is, listen. And our Lord Jesus Christ adorned this manner of life by his presence and first miracle at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And then it says, it signifies marriage. It signifies to us the mystery of the union between Christ and his church, and the Holy Scriptures commend it to be honoured among all people. Have you ever thought that not only is the wedding at Cana a sign of something else, that every wedding, we had one here yesterday, is a sign of Christ's union with his church. Every marriage is a scale model of the relationship we are going to have with Christ for all eternity. And here in Cana, Jesus is involved in a marriage. That sign of union between Christ and his church when he will be groom and the church will be his bride. The final clue. The final clue is in the last line that John pens in this story in verse 11. He wrote this: "What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory." This is a story of Jesus' glory. Glory is about Jesus' magnificence, his wonder, his beauty, his splendor. Jesus has revealed in this story something of the grandeur and brilliance of who he is, his glory. Remember from last week, from John chapter 1, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. This is a story about glory. Let's put the clues together. You can see them on the screen. The couple's shame, Jesus' hour, the jars, the wine, the marriage, and his glory. This is not a story about catering, but it's about Jesus meeting a deep human need to deal with shame and disgrace deeper than running out of wine, by foretelling the hour of his death, the death that deals with our purification before a holy God in a better way than stone water jars do. Because Jesus' death replaces our sin and shame with an abundance of joy in the heavenly banquet of rich food and fine wine, the best wine, where we will be united with him as the church becomes his bride. Now that's glory, isn't it? That's glory. That is a glorious story of what God has done. So there's just one last thing. And that's the ultimate winemaker and me. The ultimate winemaker and you. You see, there is not a person among us who does not understand shame and disgrace. Oh no, you probably haven't suffered the shame of running out of wine at a party. But ever since Adam and Eve ate of the fruit in the garden and had to cover their nakedness with fig leaves because they were ashamed, human beings have known shame and disgrace. Each one of us knows the darkness and ugliness that lurks within us. We curate ourselves for the world to see, don't we? We curate who we are by what we wear, by the pretenses we put on, by the dressed up lies about our hearts, by the manners and customs that cover our true selves, through our social media personas that we project. And in the past, through the ritual washing of our hands with purifying water. All to cover our shame like a fig leaf. Because we know that even the people who love us the most might reject us if they truly knew what lurked within. What we thought in private, what we did behind closed doors. That's shame And it's the human condition. Some in our generation have tried to deal with that by becoming shameless. And we see plenty of this in the world today, don't we? People parading their inner muck for all the world to see and being proud of what the rest of us hide. That's a particular feature of our secular culture today. But we all know shame. Even the shameless ones know shame. Shame about our looks. Shame about our mistakes. Shame about our regrets. Shame about our failures. Shame about our thoughts. Shame about our hearts. And this mundane story about wine at a party is a sign that Jesus is the only pathway to deal forever with shame. His death cleanses us from shame. His death takes our punishment. As he dies on the cross, he bears the shame of the world. And it cleanses us, it redeems us, it de-shames us, it replaces our disgrace with his grace and honour. And it wipes away our tears. And his death ushers in the beautiful moment when he fills our table with the finest of foods and the best of wines, and he lavishes us with his grace and unites us to himself, the groom to the bride in the eternal marriage of the Lamb. My friend had been a missionary on a tough assignment in a really difficult part of the world. And she had come home early from her missionary assignment. There's nothing quite like the shame of being sent out from a church full of hope and joy and prayers to represent that church and to preach Christ on the other side of the world, and for it not to work out, and for you to come home a failure. An experienced missionary was assigned to debrief my friend, to sit down and talk about the mission field and talk about her return and re-entry. But he had an unusual request. He wanted a budget for food. Because when she walked in for the debrief, there in front of her was a table laden with the most beautiful food and wine. Because he wanted to celebrate with her the grace of God in her life and his blessing and God's word that she was worthy, that there was no shame or disgrace in failure, because Jesus had done it all. And so began her healing. My brothers and sisters, this story of the little Cana town where the word went all around that he had turned water into wine, that so moved Johnny Cash, is a story that reveals Jesus' glory. each and every one of us is a shame-filled failure, full of disgrace. But each one of us is welcomed to a banquet of the finest wine, won by the death of Jesus, when his hour had finally come. It's no wonder that the last words of our reading today is that the disciples believed in him. Do you?